every computer can be hacked. This is an expression you probably have heard before. But is it true? Should we be scared about that? Or is it false and just fear-mongering? In this video, I want to explore the zero-day industry and state-of-the-art exploitation. For that, I talked to several researchers who I believe could actually do it. So I hope you are as excited as I am to hear what they have to say. As you can see on my channel, I have quite a bit of experience in basically every area of hacking, but I feel very, very far away from being able to hack something like an iPhone or a browser. So I do believe I have a good intuition about this topic, but I think it's better to hear from people who actually have done this kind of vulnerability research. So I asked several people I know on Twitter, but unfortunately many couldn't say anything because they actively work in this area and their partners didn't like that. But I did get a few responses. Steve, or Mr. Me, Pwn to Own winner.
How you going, LiveOverflow? It's Steve Seeley here, aka Mr. Me.
Sigutza, very well known in the iOS jailbreak scene. It's CN, or Amy, from Red2. She's very experienced in browser exploitation.
Hi, my name is Amy Burnett. I am the lead on the browser exploitation training at Red2 Systems. I do research specifically into browser exploits.
Xerab, a very experienced researcher, also into iOS, and there was just recently a Frag profile about him. If you want to check his credentials, read that. And Steven, CTS, he also did iOS.
Hi, I'm Steven, and I'm a security researcher. In the past, I worked at an iOS exploit shop. Now, I'd be happy to provide some of my opinions or general insights on the so-called exploit industry.
Oh, and by the way, you should check out his YouTube channel, amazing content. So all of them are extremely skilled and have participated in top competitions such as Pwn to Own, worked in companies developing exploits, or just did it for fun. I think their thoughts about this topic are more relevant than mine, and I guess more convincing than what I would have to say too. But before we head into some of their insights, I want to establish a few base facts. First, there is this law of security, which says that the more complexity a system has, the more security relevant bugs it contains. And when you look at a modern browser or a whole device like an iPhone or Android, they include an incredible amount of very complex software. So based on this chart, there will be bugs. But they also invest a lot into fixing those bugs, so they bring that curve down. Though the real issue is there are always new features implemented, so complexity keeps growing, thus new bugs will also be introduced. As Amy says about this.
Browsers are definitely one of the scariest remote attack vectors to me, but that might be partly because of the amount of research that I've done in them. The attack surface is really pretty scary and probably something that most people don't consider when they go and click on a link.
Now, let's have a look at Zerodium for a moment. They are a company that buys certain vulnerabilities and resell them for even more money. You all know the fake Hollywood-style hacking where somebody just pushes a button and remotely hacks into a computer or phone. Well, that's kind of true for these kind of vulnerabilities. But we talk about those kind of prices as well. And keep in mind, for the actual end customer, it will be even more expensive. This is only what is paid at the end of the chain to the researcher. So for a Windows remote zero-click exploit, they pay $1 million. For a Chrome exploit escalating to become admin, where the victim just has to visit a malicious website, they pay $500,000. But it gets crazy with mobile payments, because an iOS or Android zero-click exploit with persistence, so with installing a Trojan, just by maybe knowing your phone number, boom, you got hacked. They pay $2 to $2.5 million for those vulnerabilities. But if you don't need persistence, because who reboots their phone anyway, and you can just hack it again when it got rebooted, they pay around $1 to $1.5 million. Anyway, what's important to keep in mind, these exploits listed here are not theoretical. You can absolutely assume that all of those vulnerabilities exist and they are getting sold and used. But I didn't show this list to impress you with the dollar amounts. The reason why I show this is because when I look at my phone, this list reminds me that I know for a fact that there are these kind of vulnerabilities in there. If you are skeptical about that and you don't trust my assumptions on this Zerodium list, just go to any phone vendor. They will confirm this fact. Just think about the previous phone version and look at the security advisories from the vendors. Here, for example, iOS, and just last version, there was an issue in I/O mobile frame buffer. An application may be able to execute arbitrary code with kernel privileges. Apple is aware of a report that this issue may have been actively exploited in real life. And oh, I just noticed I haven't updated my phone yet. Let's do that right now. You should too. And I have more proof that there are these kind of vulnerabilities in your device right now. There are competitions such as Pwn2Own or the Chinese Tianfu Cup, where at the day of the competition there will be a completely new and fully patched device. And here are just the results of 2021. Apple Safari, Microsoft Exchange, Ubuntu, and more. Or here Tianfu Cup, iOS 15, Docker, Qemu, Adobe PDF. Basically everything gets owned, and that every year. Anyway, it's absolutely certain that there are people who have access to these kind of unknown exploits or 0 days. And there are, of course, also the people who have the skills and experience to find them. No doubts about that. So now that we have established that, let's hear some thoughts from the researchers themselves. I hope that gives you some idea of how special these vulnerabilities are. And maybe a good start is to ask about, is it possible to find and exploit these vulnerabilities alone?
I would say that I can if I put enough energy into it. In the most humblest way I would say is I probably could if I really focus on it.
I initially started doing the research mostly on my own, but after starting Rep 2, I found that a team, even a small team, can be a huge help when it comes to building out different parts of the exploit chain in parallel, or building a fuzzing system, or a system to test your exploit against different versions of your target. Either way, the research is definitely doable by individuals, although it may take more time or a good amount of luck.
As you just heard, for developing exploits, it makes sense to have a team. There's a huge part that is similar to software development. You need debug or testing tools, and doing that alone is just insane amount of work. Maybe it's like a developer who says, yeah, I could develop Facebook on my own. In theory, that is true, every developer could do that, but in reality, it's way too much work. Dividing the problem and doing the stuff in parallel just makes it much more realistic.
Most of the exploits nowadays are part of a full chain. A full chain is basically like a series of exploits that are necessary to ensure the full compromise of a system. So maybe 10 years ago, a full chain might be doable by a single researcher. But nowadays, that requires an immense amount of skill and dedication to make a full chain by yourself. And these targets get harder every year. So nowadays, researchers tend to specialize a lot as well. That's why most of the zero-day industry operates in teams. For example, you might focus on like, oh, I do the Linux kernel. Oh, I do WebKit. I do Safari. I do V8.
As Steven said, to compromise a modern phone or even a browser, you need several vulnerabilities that you have to combine to break through the individual layers. And these layers are so complex that researchers often have to specialize.
I think nowadays, a single researcher, if they're dedicated enough, they can still make a weaponized exploit. If you look at Ian Beer's research on Bluetooth on iOS, you can see that just a single guy, to be fair, he is one of the best in the world, he can still make like a fully wormable iOS bug, right? And all you have to do is just like be near their phone and your phone is compromised. So that type of thing is still possible in 2021. But I would say that type of thing is extremely difficult.
Xerab also said about this.
I work alone most of the time, but I do occasionally chat and take input from a few selected friends. It is certainly possible to do it alone, but I guess it's somewhat easier in a team. I say somewhat because even in a team, usually only 1 or 2 people bear the brunt of the exploit per se, while the others are working to polish. I'm not trying to minimize the importance of the extra work, it just happens that I don't usually need nor release easy to use one-click solutions for any client, less more so for the masses.
And here is an important detail. Xerab said easy to use one-click solution, which some people would call weaponized exploit. When talking within our industry, it's kind of clear what it means, but outside of our industry, this term is also very loaded. weapon. Weapons are used in war and directly kill people. Exploits and the intelligence gathered through implants can of course be reason for a military strike or other violent actions, but I do think there's a big difference between the violence of real weapons and exploits. So many in our industry prefer the term production grade or operationalized exploits. So these terms refer to an exploit that is very easy usable and very stable. So basically a customer who has no idea about iOS exploitation, they can just enter a phone number on a graphical interface, press a button and a phone gets hacked. And that requires a lot of additional work to put into the exploit. So now that we have established that there is a 99.9% certainty that there are vulnerabilities in the devices you use, and it's probably still possible for individuals to find and exploit those vulnerabilities, but most likely it will be done by a team, it becomes clear that the original question about whether every computer can be hacked is uninteresting. It doesn't help us in real life. Every human could be killed doesn't mean every human gets killed. Is that a bad comparison? Complex devices will probably always be hackable as long as they keep adding features and making them more and more complex. So the real question we should ask ourselves is not whether your device can be hacked. The question must be, how likely is it going to happen to you? Will your device be hacked? This, of course, is a very complex and very subjective question about risk. Everybody has a different risk feeling. But who would be better to help us understand this risk than the people who actually have the ability to find such vulnerabilities? How scared should you be?
I would say that I think it doesn't make sense to live in fear of 0 days, because I would say that, using technology is just a very small part of my life. I'm not going to let that dominate my life, right?
I do think getting O-Date is a very real possibility, and it does factor into my threat model, but I certainly don't live in fear, so to speak. If someone knows your setup, as you should assume, and puts in the time and effort, they can always pwn you. But yeah, I don't think the general population should be worried about 0 days. There's a whole bunch of risks that are far greater, like phishing or a company mishandling your data.
I think it's highly unlikely that I'm going to become a target because there's just a lot of smarter people out there with a lot more important information on their hands. And I feel like burning a 0 day to target me would be kind of a waste, but each to their own.
I'm certainly worried about using browsers, both because of my own work, but mostly because I've seen the work of people way more talented than me, and I can tell you it's scary. Besides the browser, the rest of the phone as a whole I'm less worried about. I mean, Apple is doing a decent job, especially with the hardware mitigations. It is a common misconception that 0 days are expensive. Yes, they are, but it really depends on return on investment. Say you catch 50 targets with a 0 day you don't care much about. It eventually gets discovered, sure, but in present terms, $500,000 for 50 targets is $10,000 per target, which is not that much for a serious actor.
But in the end, I guess if someone really wanted to target me, like a serious adversary, who are persistent and relentless, then I'm likely to fall prey, but there's a point of time when you just kind of make peace with that and just accept it for what it is.
So I think the best way to approach this type of problem is to think in terms of the economics for the attacker. So imagine you're the attacker and you have a business to run, right? So how much does the attack cost and how much would the attack generate in revenue for me? The cost of mounting this attack is very high. So you need a very high return on that investment to make it worthwhile, right? So for example, if I'm some random crime guy, I'm not going to take this Chrome exploit, pay like $1 bajillion for it, and then try to use that on random users, right? For example, let's say I hacked your computer. What can I get out of your computer? I can use it for, I guess, crypto mining. I could do ransomware. I could harvest your cookies or autofill and so on. But how much is that really worth? It's probably only worth like a few bucks per end system, maybe more out of ransomware. But it's hard to say, right? And that initial investment is extremely high. And the thing is, like, once you start your campaign, now it's a race against time because all these browsers, they all auto-update, assuming that people have the auto-update on, which is like most people these days, because that's the default.
So as you can see, they respect the technology and know that there is a risk, but also they don't really worry that much. Especially 99% of people who watch this video on YouTube, you really shouldn't worry too much. But of course, there are people who should maybe worry a bit more. There are groups of people we know who get attacked with those exploits. Citizen Lab has several great reports about that.
Now, on the other hand, I think that people of interest should be worried about their security. And those would be like journalists, dissidents, government officials, politicians, executives, and so on. Or, exploit developers.
Yes, you heard right.
There's also incentive for attackers to target security researchers, as researchers often have access to privileged information or maybe other vulnerabilities or exploits that they have produced themselves. And we've seen this happen earlier this year with the Twitter and LinkedIn campaigns, which were using a Chrome 0-day to target security researchers, which they had tricked into going onto their blog page.
This happened, for example, to CTS.
Some hackers from North Korea actually slid into my Twitter DMs and also the Twitter DMs of a bunch of other security researchers. And they tried to basically use a Chromium 0-day on us. So they were like, hey, please check out my blog. It's got my new research on it. What do you think about it? And then the blog post had like a Chromium drive-by 0-day. So that was pretty sketch.
So what can you do if you are a journalist or in some other high-risk group?
I think there is not much that you can do to completely rule out the possibility of 0-day being used against you. I think that a few things can help, but nothing can guarantee your security against 0-day. I think that practicing security by isolation also helps. For example, I don't keep my exploits on my personal device.
In terms of reducing browser attack surface, a big thing is disabling JavaScript by default. This has gotten harder with the modern web, which requires a lot of JavaScript to give you anything but a blank white page. There are extensions out there like Umatrix, which give you a good amount of control over this and can make it a bit easier to manage your JavaScript usage. If you want to go even further, you can usually disable specific web features using either browser flags or command line arguments. And this will help cut down the attack surface even when JavaScript is enabled for a site. For example, one thing that I do is I disable the just-in-time compiler and also WebAssembly as part of Chrome. And this will help cut down on attacks that are targeting the compiler or the WebAssembly system. Now, it's not going to stop all attacks potentially, but it will cut down on that attack surface. On a device like an iPhone, it might be a little bit harder to have such granular control, but something that I've done in the past is have two browsers, one of which is, let's say, Safari, and we have JavaScript disabled. And then if I decided that I need to run it, we can move it into the other environment.
I just try to follow best practice as much as possible, right? So using universal two-factor auth, password managers, I don't click stupid links, all that kind of stuff really plays into it a lot. As long as you can make it harder for the attacker, right? And that's what, I guess, defense in depth theory sort of goes into, is that just making it harder for attackers, right?
Now, if you notice you got exploited and a Trojan or a so-called agent is running on your device, I guess the best thing is to immediately disconnect from the internet and I guess reinstall the device. But if you don't know if you got infected, there is maybe one very small but possibly effective trick. Check out the recent Amnesty International report about the Pegasus malware. Pegasus is no longer maintaining persistence on iOS devices. And here is what Bill from Citizen Lab is saying about that. The NSO Group's Pegasus spyware delivered via zero-click exploit is no longer persistent in the strict sense of the word. It doesn't come back when you reboot. Persistence is achieved via firing the zero-click again. The lack of traditional persistence is a feature. It makes the spyware more nimble and prevents recovery of the spyware and exploits from forensic analysis. And Steven also said the same.
If you have a phone, rebooting it every now and then can help mitigate the impact of an implant because not all implants have good persistence capabilities.
So kids, remember, always reboot your phone. I hope this gave you a good overview about the threat of 0 days. And now let's come back to the question, can every device be hacked? We established that for complex devices such as phones and computers, that is like 99% true. But at the same time, it's so complex that it requires a huge amount of time and experience to do that. And nowadays, to get an actual full chain weaponized, or rather production grade or operationalized exploit ready for use, it's really only possible to do that with a team of people, which means it's very costly to do so and usually only worth it if there is a considerable return of that investment. Which means it's almost exclusively used today in state-level hacking by intelligence agencies gathering, well, intelligence on various people of interest, regimes to go against journalists and activists, and probably corporate espionage. So if you are not belonging to such a group, you should not worry about 0 days. And I can with high confidence tell you that your bragging friend or ex-partner does not have this kind of capability. They will use other much simpler tricks like phishing to get to you. Those are the kinds of attacks you should worry about. And I recently made a video about protecting yourself against phishing. That's like 1,000 times more important for your security than thinking about 0 days. And lastly, 0 days are only expensive because they use unknown vulnerabilities. It's a premium, you pay for that. And they have a limited lifetime until they are patched. But there are many more known vulnerabilities, we call them N days, with exploits that are much cheaper. So it might be totally feasible to attack you with those. Luckily, every important device and software has auto updates by default enabled. I know they are annoying, but please don't disable them. This keeps the bar high enough for you so you don't have to worry.